Hello friends, this is Jan Curcio welcoming you back to Breaking Bread for You with the fifth presentation in a series leading up to our commemoration of Christ's crucifixion and resurrection, Christ's agony at Gethsemane. Now, let me ask you, did you ever read a passage only to find that what you expected to read was missing? Such as in the story of Jesus walking on the water in Mark's, Luke's, and John's Gospels, where there is no mention of Peter's attempt to walk on the water. Well, I'm sure that by now you've realized that only Matthew recorded that incident, chapter 14, verse 27. And that the gospel writers did not include all of the accounts of Christ's life and ministry in their gospels. Well, we weren't the first to be concerned with this, for a Syrian scholar from the 2nd century by the name of Tatian took on the arduous task of harmonizing or blending the four gospels into one continuous story. Tatian called his work the Diatessaron, meaning of four, written in his native tongue, Syriac, further translated into Persian, Arabic, Greek, and Latin. The Diatessaron was used in the liturgy of the Syrian church and elsewhere up into the 5th century, when church leadership in Rome decided that the gospel should remain as four separate accounts. Now, it is my understanding that their rejection of Tatian's Diatessaron was due to the omissions and additions he made for the sake of chronology and coherence. I recognize the purpose in having four similar but varying Gospels, in that it slows us down in our study of the Scriptures, causing us to search through all four Gospels for all the information that forms a complete record of the life and ministry of Jesus of Nazareth, and that will help us to grasp what the writers wanted us to understand about him and his ministry of salvation. Therefore, I agree with the consensus that harmonizations function as supplements to the four Gospels, not as replacements. But as an exercise in the study of the last days of Christ on earth, I've attempted to do my own harmonizing of the four Gospel accounts of Christ's agony at Gethsemane, dovetailing the text into a chronological, inclusive, and lucid story. Given the brevity of the four Gethsemane accounts, it was not a difficult task to accomplish, finding no need to either omit or add to the texts. After having done so, I recognize just how neatly all the segments fit together, forming the coherent account I desired, which for me testifies to the integrity of the four Gospels. Now, before we get into Christ's Gethsemane ordeal, let me point out the variances of the four Gospel accounts, which should give you an appreciation of the harmonizing of Christ's agony. From the beginning, Matthew and Mark report that Jesus told the disciples to sit, for he was going to pray. But in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus tells them that they are to pray so as to not to succumb to temptation. Matthew and Mark tell us that Jesus took Peter, James, and John with him to pray, while Luke omits taking anyone, but adds that he moved to a stone's throw away from them where he knelt to pray. John does not mention any of this, for as his gospel is written, soon after they had arrived at Gethsemane, Judas and his sinister entourage show up to arrest Jesus. In the synoptics, it is mentioned that Jesus found the disciples sleeping instead of praying, 3 times in Matthew and Mark, and once in Luke. All 3 synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, mention Jesus asking the Father to remove the cup that is before him, followed by surrendering to his Father's will. Luke is the only writer who tells us that an angel had come to strengthen Jesus, and that he was in such extreme agony that he sweat profusely with drops of blood. All 4 Gospels mention Judas Iscariot's kiss of betrayal, with none of the writers letting him off the hook. And all 4 Gospels tell about Peter slicing the ear off of the high priest's servant, but only Luke mentions that Jesus miraculously healed him, which he would have interest in, being a physician. Only Matthew mentions that Jesus rebuked Peter for doing that, and in John he sternly reminds Peter that prophecy has to be fulfilled in regard to his betrayal and his arrest. And unique to Matthew is Jesus telling Peter that he can call upon the Father to send 12 legions of angels to rescue him if he chose. Only John has Jesus asking his assailants who they were looking for twice, and after responding with, "I am he," twice, they fell to the ground both times. However, the 3 synoptic Gospels report that Jesus asks them why they have come to him with weapons like he was a thief, when they could have taken him when he had openly taught in the temple courts. Then in Matthew, Mark, and John, Jesus states that this must happen, that prophecy should be fulfilled, except for Luke, wherein Jesus proclaims to those who came for him that this was their hour and the power of darkness. Only in John's account does Jesus tell them not to arrest his disciples, and Mark is the only writer to report the incident of the young man wearing and losing his linen wrap and fleeing from the garden naked. So let me finish this summary by saying that in spite of the differences in the accounts, for me none of them can be taken as discrepancy or contradiction. But as with any group of writers, we have to understand that they reported incidents from what they either remembered had happened or what they had been told by the eyewitnesses to the events. So let's begin to read a harmonization of the 4 gospel accounts using the texts from the King James Version. And I quote, "When Jesus had spoken these words, he went forth with his disciples over the brook Kedron to the Mount of Olives, where was a garden called Gethsemane, into which he entered, and his disciples, and Judas also, which betrayed him, knew the place, for Jesus ofttimes resorted there with his disciples. And when he was at the place, he said unto them, Pray that ye enter not into temptation. And he took with him Peter and the 2 sons of Zebedee, and they are, as you know, James and John, and began to be sorrowful and very heavy. Then saith he unto them, My soul is exceeding sorrowful, even unto death. Tarry ye here, and watch with me. And he was withdrawn from them about a stone's cast, and kneeled down and fell on his face, and prayed, saying, O my Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as thou wilt. And there appeared an angel unto him from heaven, strengthening him. And being in an agony, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat was as it were great drops of blood falling down to the ground. And when he rose up from prayer, and was come to his disciples, he found them sleeping for sorrow, and said unto them, Why sleep ye? Could not thou watch 1 hour? Rise and pray, lest ye enter into temptation. And he came and found them asleep again, for their eyes were heavy. And he left them and went away again, and prayed the 3rd time, saying the same words. And he came the 3rd time, and said unto them, Sleep on now, and take your rest. And then, It is enough, the hour is come. Behold, the Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. And immediately while he yet spoke came Judas, one of the 12, and with him a great multitude with swords and staves from the chief priests and the scribes and the elders. And he that betrayed him had given them a token, saying, Whomsoever I shall kiss, that same is he. Take him and lead him away safely. And as soon as he was come, he goeth straightway to him. And Jesus said unto him, Friend, wherefore art thou come? And said Judas, Master, Master, and kissed him. And Jesus said, Betrayest thou the Son of Man with a kiss? Jesus therefore, knowing all things that should come upon him, went forth and said unto them, Whom seek ye? They answered him, Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus said unto them, I am he. And Judas also, which betrayed him, stood with them. As soon then as he had said unto them, I am he, they went backward and fell to the ground. Then asked he them again, Whom seek ye? And they said, Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus answered, I have told you that I am he. If therefore ye seek me, let these go their way. That the saying might be fulfilled which he spoke, of them which thou gavest me, I lost none. And they laid their hands on him and took him. Then Simon Peter, having a sword, drew it and smote the high priest's servant and cut off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. Then said Jesus unto Peter, Put up thy sword into the sheath. The cup which my Father hath given me, shall I not drink it? Thinkest thou that I cannot now pray to my Father, and he shall presently give me more than 12 legions of angels? Suffer ye thus far. And he touched his ear and healed him. And Jesus answered and said unto them, Are ye come out as against a thief, with swords and with staves to take me? I was daily with you in the temple teaching, and ye took me not. But the scriptures must be fulfilled. And they all forsook him and fled. And there followed him a certain young man, having a linen cloth cast about his naked body. And the young man laid hold on him. And he left the linen cloth, and fled from them naked. And so ends my harmonization. Now, if you were wondering who the man in the linen cloth was, there is a consensus that he was the gospel writer Mark himself, since the episode is only recorded in his gospel. There are a number of 16th century classical paintings depicting Mark the gospel writer wrapped in a linen cloth, amongst the other 3 evangelists, as depicted here in this frame. Church tradition has it that Mark the gospel writer was the nude man in the garden, who was actually John Mark, the cousin of Barnabas, Colossians 4:10, both of whom went with Peter on missionary trips, Acts 12. It is taken then that John Mark was an interpreter for Peter and used Peter's sermons to form Mark's gospel, on which Matthew and Mark based theirs. However, most scholars reject John Mark as being the gospel writer for lack of textual and historical evidence. Mark was not one of the original 12 disciples, and it is uncertain if he was a follower of Jesus before his crucifixion or was converted through the evangelizing of the apostles. Although I can't say that others besides Jesus' 12 disciples attended the Last Supper, as some do speculate, it is certain that the young man had waited for them to finish supper and then followed behind the 12 to Gethsemane, which is all we are told in Mark's gospel. It is said that he followed Jesus to the garden, from which it has been taken that in the practical sense he was a follower of Jesus. Now, going with his dress of a linen cloth, the young man was most likely a Greek, wearing what Greeks wore at that time in warm weather, a linen mantle called chlamys, fastened around the right shoulder, that left the left side of the body exposed, as depicted in this frame, which could easily have been pulled loose in the scuffle. Mark uses the Greek term for the cloth, sindon, which is translated muslin or fine linen cloth, used in the New Testament for only one other very significant cloth, that which Joseph of Arimathea wrapped around the body of Jesus for burial, Matthew 27:59. Now, it is thought that Mark, the gospel writer, was Greek or Hellenized Jew, that is, a Jew who preferred Greek manners and customs over Jewish orthodoxy. Hellenized Jews changed their names to Greek names. They attended Greek oratory and plays, adapted to Greek dress and diet, even with men frequenting the Greek gymnasiums where they could exercise naked. Whether or not our young man was Mark the gospel writer, he might have been from a group of Hellenized Jews who just days before Christ's ordeal had asked Philip and Andrew to introduce them to Jesus. the episode of which is recorded only in John's Gospel, chapter 22. Jesus responds to the request by declaring that something of great importance is about to occur. And I quote, "The hour has come that the Son of Man should be glorified. Most assuredly, I say to you, unless a grain of wheat falls into the ground and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it produces much grain." Now, of course, Jesus is pointing to his death and the expansion of the church by the apostles. And going on with the passage, it says, "He who loves his life will lose it, and he who hates his life in this world will keep it for eternal life. If anyone serves me, let him follow me, and where I am, there my servants will also be. If anyone serves me, him my Father will honor." Now, what it is confusing about this passage is to whom Jesus is addressing, whether Philip and Andrew or the group of Greeks who were either Hellenized Jews, for it is said that they came to worship at the feast, or those referred to as God-fearers, Gentiles who converted to Judaism. What we can say is that they had heard the buzz about Jesus when they came to town, about how he rode triumphantly through the city gate on a donkey, being hailed King of the Jews, after which he furiously cleansed the temple of money changers and livestock, and returned the next morning to teach in the temple precinct. If Jesus had addressed these Greeks, he would have perceived that they wanted to learn from him, perhaps even being discipled by him, given that he asserts that to be his disciple, they would have to be willing to give up their lifestyles, even their very lives. It is certain that Jesus was addressing them, given that he declares that if they do that, they should be allowed to follow him and serve him, and in doing that, they would be honored by the Father. Since Philip and Andrew had already done all of that, I take it that Jesus was addressing the Greeks, and that one or more followed Jesus and his disciples to Gethsemane. Given that Mark is the only one to tell the story of the fleeing naked man, it indicates that the incident was very important to him, whether it was him or not. Based on this, it is plausible that this might be where Mark, the gospel writer, began to follow Jesus, and with the clothing malfunction simply being an unfortunate incident. Yet I doubt that and believe that there is significance to losing that wrap. If there is significance to having been stripped of the linen cloth, in light of the other linen cloth, the burial shroud of Christ, it is plausible that Mark included the incident of losing the wrap to illustrate the contrast between the fright and flight to Christ's steadfastness and submission to his ordeal, or with the loss of the linen cloth from the young man's body, contrasted to the provision of the linen wrapping for Christ's body by Joseph of Arimathea. But better still, the young man's wrap having been left behind, being compared to the shroud of Christ being left behind, functioning as a foretelling of the resurrection. This is just one of many queries I am saving for when I get to question the Bible writers in person. Now, let's look at other significant things found in the four gospel accounts that may be of interest to you. For instance, there is the issue of the name Gethsemane, which means oil press, which I find holds poetic significance in that it is the place where oil was squeezed out of the olives, and the place where Christ was profoundly emotionally pressed, having shed great drops of bloody sweat. Luke is the only writer to have mentioned that Christ sweat blood, and again, he would have been interested in this being a physician and aware of the condition presently called hematidrosis, in which capillary blood vessels around the sweat glands rupture, with blood exuding out of the sweat glands, and individuals who are under extreme physical or emotional stress. So could Jesus have sweat blood? Although the grammar might suggest that his sweat fell like great drops of blood, given the emotional state Jesus was in, the answer is yes, he could have, and I believe that he had. Another interesting segment found only in Matthew's and Mark's accounts, where Jesus takes with him to pray Peter, James, and John, his inner circle of disciples, who had also been with him on the mountaintop in his transfiguration, are now with him in the valley of his agony. And as with Christ's transfiguration, when the three didn't comprehend the great significance of it all, in his agony, they still don't get it, evident in having allowed themselves to fall asleep, in spite of knowing how deeply troubled Jesus had become. But the most significant part of the Gethsemane episode for me is when Jesus asks his Father that the cup pass from him, the cross where the sin of all mankind would be laid upon him. Yet he knows that this is his purpose in being incarnated, to suffer a sacrificial death for the payment of our sin. The cup can be viewed as an allusion to the Passover cup of wine passed around at Seder's, where even the bitter dregs at the bottom must be consumed. Christ's cup of bitterness was to be fully consumed by him, even down to the most bitter dregs of the cross. In applying this passage to our lives, we have to consider that all of Christ's followers fled as he was being taken away, which should make us look straight into our own pasts when we abandoned the Lord, by fleeing from him when he called upon us, only wanting to correct us or to guide us to the truth and our salvation. Jesus had just told his disciples that the circumstances were dire, and that he would be arrested and handed over to the chief priests to be killed, and that they were to pray and to watch, for the time had come. But instead they fell asleep, like they never heard what he had told them. Likewise, Christ is asking us to stay awake, remain sober, and be watchful and prepared and ready for his coming. Like Peter, who denied even having known him, we have denied him through our apathy and our silence, times when we could have shared the gospel, but didn't for fear of being rejected or humiliated, or when the opportunity arose to take a stand for righteousness, we walked away. And how many nights have we fallen asleep after a few minutes of shallow prayer, not even spending 1 hour in a 24-hour day devoted to prayer, communing with the one who endured the cross for us. And then there are the Judases who have betrayed Christ for material gain, who thwart the preaching of the true gospel of Jesus Christ, preaching instead a false gospel in which our sinfulness doesn't matter to God, that he overlooks those things that are forbidden to us in the scriptures, because as they say, after all, he's the God of love and the God of grace. They are like the chief priests and the Pharisees, who used, abused, and ignored those they were called to serve, only concerned with their own well-being and prosperity at the expense of the needy and poor. So what would Christ want us to walk away with? I think that the answer lies in the heart of this passage, in Jesus' demonstration of his obedience to his Father, saying, "Nevertheless, not what I will, but what thou wilt." Although Jesus would suffer beyond what any man could, having the sins of the world laid upon him by his own Father, not being guilty of even one of them, being obedient to the call for our sakes, that our sins, which are many, would be paid for. So let's commit to seeking after and practicing not what we will, but what Christ wills for our lives. Thank you for viewing, and please subscribe and hit that bell to receive notice of my next presentation in this series leading up to Resurrection Sunday. So may God bless you all in every area of your lives.